Now I would like to next invite Jay Marlowe, Associate Professor from the University of Auckland, to respond to that. Jay's an Associate Professor and he focuses on refugee studies and settlement futures as it relates to migration policy, role of technologies and disaster risk reduction. In 2019 he became a Rutherford Discovery Fellow to pursue a 5-year research program related to refugee settlement trajectories. As a social worker and former visiting fellow with the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford University, he has worked with refugee communities as a practitioner and researcher, publishing more than 70 peer-reviewed papers. Please, Jay.
Can you hear me? Yep. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko grandfather te monga, ko nui te awa, ko mewhawa te waka, ko Boone, North Carolina te wahi, ko Jay Meredith Marlowe, aho. Kia ora, my name's Jay. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Auckland. It's great to be here, and I'd like to thank Belong Aotearoa for welcoming me, and the Pearl of Islands Foundation as well. And thank you, Sophia, for the keynote. I think one of the things that, whilst the situation in Turkey is obviously a very different context, I think there are some things that we might be able to draw some of these relevant threads together. I think particularly around this search for belonging and safety, and this request to be heard, as Rakana referred to. What I want to make clear with this is I want to make a distinction between refugee resettlement and refugee settlement. Refugee resettlement is about protection. It's about protecting people who have well-founded fears of persecution. So the discussions about how well will they integrate, are they employable, what skills do they have, is actually irrelevant at this stage. This is about protecting people who don't have a durable solution for safety and protection. Places like New Zealand can provide that. Once that's provided, after refugee resettlement, once they've arrived, we then shift to the experience of settlement. And to me, settlement is about the experience of belonging. And if we're going to be talking about that, there's a difference between presence and participation, and a difference between an invite and a welcome. So we're supposed to be talking about social cohesion, but I think we have very little understanding of what that is and who we should maybe even be cohering to. And I'll try to come around to that in a few different ways, but Jira was kind enough to give me 3 very simple questions to address, which is, what is the role of the host community, what can the government do about it, and what can we do as individuals? And everyone lives happily ever after. So I think one of the things around that's deeply embedded in the New Zealand society, if we think about the host community, I think that's deeply embedded in New Zealand, is this notion of the fair go. And but I think in order for that, just to do that, we need to turn the mirror on ourselves, all of us, to think about what are our assumptions. And when we hear this word refugee, and to think about, what are some of the ideas around Manaki Tanga that might sort of inform what a fair go might actually entail. So when I was down in Christchurch back in 2012, looking to hire someone from refugee background to do some research around the impacts of the earthquakes, I had a woman apply who spoke 5 different languages. She had a PhD, and she said it was the first job she'd been shortlisted for out of 100. So this doesn't speak about someone who doesn't want to work. This is about how willing is, an invite versus a welcome. Yes, you can come to New Zealand, but are you actually welcome here? Can you participate as a peer in civil society? And this is important. I think it just, it's part of our role as in an international community about trying to respond to this global crisis. But it also makes sense on many different levels. And I think that this is important to understand in an election year where it's probably the economic argument that's going to hold the most water. But even the economic argument actually does hold water. This morning in The Australian was a story about a small town in northern Victoria that's 230 Karen refugees that were settled there have kind of revitalized this town, worth $105 million. There's research of economists out of Europe that suggests that investing €1 in refugees yields €2 in return within 5 years. But what's central to that calculus is that they are afforded the welcome. The University of Auckland is now collecting data on students who identify as coming from a refugee background. It's almost 2% of our university. They are punching well above their weight in terms of per capita number. If you look at the number of refugees per population, they're the ones that are actually getting upskilled they'll be taking care of New Zealand in the future. I also think that the host community, if we think about turning the mirror on ourselves, we have to think about the ways that we understand them. And I've argued through previous research that it's often done through a trauma-dominated lens. And I think trauma is something that's really important to recognize, but in many ways, we need to shift that focus. It's probably true that by virtue of being a refugee, you've experienced some form of trauma, but that does not mean you're a traumatized person. And so, because if that's the label that gets associated with that, do employers want to hire traumatized people? Do we want to meet it kind of stigmatizes this experience. In my experience working as a social worker, when I used to work with people from refugee backgrounds, I actually learned that I didn't even have to go to the trauma story to actually understand where they found their forms of resilience. And actually, if I wanted to understand what trauma is, in many cases for them, it wasn't the experience of escaping across Sudan or Syria or Colombia or whatever it was. It was actually when they came to places like New Zealand where they opened themselves up to the hope that things might be different, and it didn't turn out to be that way. That was trauma. And once those things were addressed, all those previous trauma stories that they had the skills and knowledges. Their community knows how to heal. They're not tabula rasa. They're not a blank slate. But it's everyday inequality, everyday racism that actually inhibits them from accessing those tools. That was my first question. Secondly, the government. I think one of the things that we've started to see is a real shift, and that we started to understand people from refugee backgrounds as being from at risk to a risk. And this sort of poisons the discourse where suddenly we're afraid to resettle them, even though there isn't really evidence to actually suggest that. But yet it's powerful electoral politics. And really, maybe we should think about shifting from not only trying to shift it back to at risk, but then what if we were to shift it from thinking of people from refugee backgrounds as not only from at risk to a risk, to possibly to an opportunity. And if that was the case, what needs to happen is, we have to ensure community consultation. And we've got some new refugee settlement sites that are going live. How well that consultation went is up for debate, maybe a conversation for later. It requires thinking intersectionally. Oftentimes we think about refugees as ethnic location or possibly gender. We need to think about age, migration status, time settled, a range of different factors. From that, you need to work collaboratively, and then, of course, to resource those services and opportunities accordingly. I also think that, I was talking with Najir earlier even about Bangladesh, and that even moderate rises in sea level will actually displace, when we're talking about 70 million forced migrants, this will pale in comparison in the decades to come. We need to increasingly connect the dots between climate and conflict. Even the civil war in Syria was preceded by a major drought in the Fertile Crescent. Civil wars in Somalia tell similar stories. These things are not isolated from one another. New Zealand needs to be at the forefront of that. And finally, I think one thing that the government needs to do better, and I think this speaks to the realities of refugee settlement nationally, and it's reflected in multiple projects that I've been involved. Most recently, a national survey where I hired predominantly 15 people from refugee backgrounds across New Zealand to see how people were using social media in New Zealand. And it is really clear that social media for many is actually central to their sense of well-being. And yet we think about refugee settlement policy as something that is neatly bound and occurs within national borders. We need to think about its transnational implications, where we can support people that are displaced, where they can connect and bridge this distance between here and there. For many people, if they know that they can be connected to the people there, that means that they can also belong here. And finally, the individual level. To me, belonging, I'm really interested in how people define belonging. I actually wrote a book on it, and I still don't really know myself. But that might be because I got a puppy just yesterday. I've been awake since 2 in the morning. But to me, integration is all these different elements around housing, language, work, health, education, language acquisition. what belonging is these little invisible vibrating threads that connect all those things together. And that's kind of the stuff that everyone's part of, that connects people to these various different opportunities. So it is about getting to know the people around us, whether that's at school, at work, within the community. You know, language matters. Bond's given me a really hard time about using the word refugee background. And I've got my reasons for that, and I'd be happy to discuss that. But language does matter, right? If I should be using that word refugee background is an interesting discussion. I think our assumptions matter. Again, 1 minute, great. Is to think about, you know, again, when we hear that word refugee, what sort of images and words come to mind? And to critically imagine that. You know, these things sometimes can be hard to think, but they're also good to think. That we need to mobilize our capital. That, you know, this idea that sort of, when we connect to people that are like us, that helps us to get by. But also sometimes the power of weak ties that connects us to new information, new resources. It's called like the sociological WD-40. It helps people to get ahead. And with that, to also, you know, to mobilize our political capital and to engage with people that make important decisions. It's an election year. Make your voice heard.
Yeah.
And I guess with that, just to conclude, before NTR kicks me off, is that, you know, I think one of the things, you know, there's an American writer, Henry Thoreau, and he has this quote, which is, "If you build your castles in the sky, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put the foundations under them." So imagine how these things might be better. Imagine what belonging might look like. What do those invisible threads look like connected to all those different domains? And yes, that's something in the sky, but that's where it should be, right? Now the work is to put the foundations so they can be realized. Kia ora.